In the grand halls of Thebes, where golden torches flickered against towering columns, Pharaoh Seti II ruled with unmatched power. His word was law, his presence divine. Yet despite his conquests and wisdom, the greatest battle he would ever face was not with an invading army, but with his own heart. It all began on the night of the Festival of Amun, a celebration where music and dance filled the royal palace. The nobles reveled in luxury, their laughter echoing through the great temple halls. Seti, dressed in robes embroidered with gold, sat upon his throne, watching with detached amusement, until he saw her. A young servant girl, moving gracefully between the guests, her every step as fluid as the Nile itself. Unlike the noblewomen who adorned themselves with heavy jewels, she wore only a simple linen dress, yet she outshone them all. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her emerald green eyes burned with a quiet defiance, an unusual fire for a mere servant. Pharaoh Seti found himself unable to look away. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice calm, yet laced with something unfamiliar. The high priest beside him hesitated before replying. "Her name is Layla, my pharaoh, a mere servant girl from the kitchens. She is of no importance." But in that moment, Seti knew the priest was wrong. She was not just another servant. There was something dangerous about her, a mystery that called to him like an ancient spell. As the festival continued, Seti did something no pharaoh had ever done. He rose from his throne, stepping down into the crowd, moving towards the girl who had stolen his attention. Gasps filled the room, whispers spreading like wildfire. The living god of Egypt had left his place among the deities to speak to a mere commoner. Layla, unaware of his approach, was pouring wine for a nobleman when a shadow fell over her. She turned and found herself face to face with the most powerful man in the kingdom. "Your name is Layla," Seti said, his voice soft but commanding. "Tell me, do you fear me?" The room held its breath. No one spoke to the pharaoh unless spoken to. No one dared meet his gaze. And yet, Layla did. She lifted her chin, eyes burning with the same defiance that had first drawn him to her. "No, my pharaoh," she whispered, her voice steady. "Should I?" A dangerous silence followed. And then, Seti smiled. That night the festival ended, but the storm that had begun in Seti's heart was only just awakening. He had broken the sacred balance by noticing a woman of no noble blood. What was once a kingdom of order was now teetering on the edge of something unseen. Because a pharaoh's heart was never meant to belong to a servant. But Seti no longer cared. Layla was his now, and soon the world would know it. The night after the festival, the palace was alive with whispers. Servants gossiped in hushed voices, noblewomen exchanged worried glances, and the high priests gathered in secret, their faces dark with concern. "A pharaoh cannot fall for a servant girl," one of them spat, his voice sharp with disgust. "This is not love, it is madness." But madness or not, Seti did not care. For the first time in his reign, the affairs of the kingdom seemed insignificant compared to her. Layla. The name alone was enough to send a fire through his veins. He had summoned her to the royal chambers, not as a servant, but as his equal, a move that shattered every rule of the kingdom. As Layla stood before him, she did not bow. She did not tremble. She looked at him as a man, not a god. "Do you know what the priests are saying?" Seti asked, stepping closer. Layla's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "That you are a fool." A laugh escaped Seti, sharp and unexpected. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. She was fearless. "I could have you executed for such words," he teased, but there was no threat in his voice. "And yet you won't," Layla replied, tilting her head. "Because I intrigue you, my pharaoh." She was right. Seti had conquered lands, crushed rebellions, commanded armies, but this woman was his greatest challenge, and he relished every second of it. But outside these walls, the kingdom was changing. The Queen Mother, Seti's own mother, was the first to act. She stormed into the temple, where the priests and generals awaited her. "This disgrace must end," she declared, her voice laced with venom. "A servant cannot be queen. My son is blinded, and if we do not stop him now, he will bring ruin to us all." The priests nodded in agreement, their minds already weaving plans of betrayal and deception. As Seti lost himself in Layla, the very people he ruled plotted his downfall. And in the heart of the conspiracy stood a man with a secret ambition, Commander Rahim, Seti's most trusted general. He had sworn loyalty to his pharaoh, but his heart belonged to the Queen Mother. "My queen," Rahim whispered as he knelt before her, "if you wish to rid the kingdom of this girl, then I will do what must be done." The Queen Mother placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes gleaming. "Then do it, my dear Rahim. End this, before she destroys us all." That night, a plan was set into motion. As Seti held Layla in his arms, speaking of futures yet to come, a shadow moved silently through the corridors of the palace. A shadow carrying a blade meant to end a love that should have never begun. The village erupted into chaos. Torches blazed, steel clashed, and the terrified cries of villagers filled the air as Pharaoh Ramses' soldiers stormed through the narrow streets. Anaya and Khalid ran, their feet pounding against the sand, their hands locked together. Behind them, Rahim led the charge, his black horse cutting through the night like a shadow of death. His men spread out, their eyes scanning the darkened alleys, searching for the princess who had dared to defy her father. "Find them! No one leaves this village alive!" Rahim barked. Anaya's heart raced. She had lived a life of luxury, but never had she fought for her life. Khalid pulled her through a narrow passageway between two mud brick homes, his grip firm but urgent. He knew these streets. He had lived in them. "We need to get to the river," he whispered. But as they turned a corner, a group of soldiers blocked their path. "There!" one of the men shouted. Khalid pushed Anaya behind him, drawing a dagger from his belt. A craftsman, not a warrior, but love makes men fearless. The soldiers lunged. Khalid dodged one blade, slashing another soldier's arm. Anaya gasped as a sword came toward Khalid's chest, but at the last second he ducked, the blade slicing only fabric. Suddenly, Rahim himself appeared, towering over them like an executioner. His eyes locked onto Anaya. "Your father has been merciful, princess," he said, voice low but deadly. "But mercy has limits. Surrender, and I may let him live." Anaya stepped forward, her breath uneven. "And if I refuse?" Rahim smirked. "Then you will watch him die before I drag you back to the palace myself." Khalid gritted his teeth. He could see the pain in Anaya's eyes, the war raging inside her. Surrender meant life, but at what cost? Anaya's fingers tightened around Khalid's hand, and in that moment, they both knew they would rather die together than live apart. "Run," Khalid whispered. Before Rahim could react, Khalid grabbed Anaya and sprinted toward the docks, where small boats swayed along the Nile's edge. "Stop them!" Rahim roared. Arrows whistled through the air as Anaya and Khalid leapt into a boat. Khalid cut the rope, shoving them into the river's current. The last thing Anaya saw before they drifted into the mist was Rahim standing at the riverbank, sword clenched in rage. They had escaped, for now. But pharaohs do not accept defeat, and the final reckoning was yet to come. The winds of rebellion swept through Thebes like a coming storm. Rahim, once a disgraced commander, had returned as a conqueror, leading an army of traitorous generals, bribed nobles and priests who believed Seti had betrayed the gods. And at the heart of this bloody coup stood the Queen Mother, the woman who had given Seti life, now determined to take it from him. The attack came under the cover of darkness. The sound of horns and war drums shook the palace walls. Torches blazed, casting monstrous shadows as soldiers poured through the gates, their swords gleaming with the promise of betrayal. Pharaoh Seti stood upon the balcony of his chambers, watching his city burn. "So it has come to this," he murmured. Behind him, Layla rushed into the room, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. "We must escape," she pleaded. Seti turned to her, and in that moment, he knew this war was not about the throne. It was about her. It had always been about her. If he had let Layla go the night of the festival, if he had ignored the fire in his heart, none of this would have happened. But he did not regret it. "If we run now," Seti said softly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, "then they will never stop hunting us." Layla swallowed, her hands trembling. She knew he was right, but she also knew what staying meant. "Then we fight," she whispered. Seti's lips curled into a smirk. By the gods, he loved her. The great doors of the throne room burst open as Rahim and his men stormed inside. The Queen Mother watched from the shadows, her face carved from stone, as her own son stood before her, sword in hand, unbowed, unbroken. "Still clinging to power," Rahim sneered. "I was born to rule," Seti answered, "not to kneel before cowards." Rahim lunged first, steel meeting steel as the throne room became a battlefield. Seti fought like a man possessed, each strike a declaration that he would not fall easily. Layla watched, heart pounding, knowing she could only be a spectator in a war that was never meant to be hers. Until she saw it, the Queen Mother, creeping behind Seti, a dagger in her hand. "No!" Layla threw herself forward, but it was too late. The blade plunged deep into Seti's side. A sharp gasp escaped his lips, his sword clattering to the ground. Silence crashed over the throne room. The mighty Pharaoh of Egypt, the man who had defied the gods and the world for love, had fallen. The Queen Mother stepped back, her hands coated in her own son's blood, her expression unreadable. Seti collapsed to his knees, his vision swimming, his breath ragged. Layla caught him before he hit the ground, pressing a trembling hand to his wound. "Stay with me," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "You promised." Seti's lips curved into a weak smile. "Some promises," he whispered, his voice barely a breath, "are too big even for a pharaoh." And then his body went still. The great Pharaoh Seti II was dead. The rebellion ended that night. With Seti gone, there was no more war to fight. Rahim took the throne, but he was a king without a soul. The Queen Mother lived to regret her betrayal, for the gods do not favor those who kill their own blood. And Layla, she disappeared from history. Some say she fled into the desert, never to be seen again. Others say she walked into the Nile that night, choosing to follow her pharaoh in death rather than live without him. But no matter where she went, one thing was certain. The pharaoh who defied the gods for love had lost everything, and Egypt would never be the same again.